The story of the apothecaries is, at its heart, the story of medicine before medicine as we know it. Long before hospitals gleamed with sterile instruments and laboratories hummed with scientific precision, healing was entrusted to the men and women behind the wooden counters at dimly lit shops. Their shelves were lined with jars of herbs, powders, and tinctures, some drawn from centuries of folk wisdom, others from dangerous experimentation, and many from sheer audacity. To their customers, they were figures of authority and mystery, offering hope in the form of a bottle or a spoonful, often without explanation and rarely without risk. Yet the legacy of the apothecaries is not one of simple healing. It is tangled with deceit, rivalry, addiction, and harm. They were innovators who pushed medicine forward, but also charlatans who sold poison with confidence. They clashed with physicians over legitimacy, fought to maintain their trade against reformers, and fueled epidemics of addiction that reshaped families and societies. Theirs was a profession built on both necessity and exploitation, reflecting the desperation of a world in which illness was constant and cures were scarce. This series explores the rise and fall of the apothecaries, tracing their journey from trusted healers to controversial figures, standing trial in the court of public opinion and scientific progress. It uncovers not only the remedies they sold, but also the human stories of trust and betrayal, of survival and loss that defined their trade. By revisiting their history, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the roots of modern medicine are entangled with poison as much as with cure, and that the legacy of the apothecaries, in all its contradictions, still lingers in the way we trust, fear, and consume medicine today. The world of the apothecary was one of shadows and glass, of powders ground fine beneath mortar and pestle, of liquids stored in stoppered bottles, whose colors caught what little light seeped through narrow shop windows. To step into an apothecary's shop in the 17th, 18th, or even early 19th century was to step into a place where science and superstition lived uneasily side by side. The air smelled of camphor, vinegar, and herbs drying on hooks overhead. Wooden drawers lined the walls, each marked with Latin inscriptions few customers could understand, promising solutions to ailments that baffled ordinary men and women. It was here, in these dim sanctuaries, that a patient desperate for relief might find hope or poison, or both in the same vial. Apothecaries stood at a strange crossroads of society. They were not physicians, for they lacked the lofty university education that physicians boasted. But neither were they simple herbalists peddling remedies from hedgerows and gardens. They were traders in compounds, keepers of recipes that were part knowledge and part mystery, men whose craft combined fragments of Galen's ancient humoral theory, medieval alchemy, and the practical wisdom of generations of healers. To many, they seemed closer to sorcerers than doctors. And yet, for the vast majority of people who could not afford a physician's expensive consultation, the apothecary was the only accessible healer in town. The poor and the middling classes relied on them not only for medicines, but for advice, guidance, and reassurance. To enter their shops was to step into a world where knowledge was power, and the balance of that power rested heavily in the apothecary's hands. The shelves of an apothecary's shop were filled with curiosities. Dried snakes hung alongside bundles of lavender. Glass jars glistened with powders of strange hues, ochres and blues that hinted at minerals ground from distant mines. There was powdered mummy, imported at great expense, believed to hold the essence of life. There were vials of mercury, heavy and silver, a substance so alluring in its quick movement that it seemed alive. There were bundles of rhubarb root, barks of exotic trees, and exotic spices shipped in from colonies far across the seas. Customers marveled at the variety, though most could not begin to guess which powders might heal and which might kill. To them, the apothecary was a gatekeeper to mysteries beyond their comprehension. Yet this world was not only exotic and alluring, it was also dangerous. The apothecary was both savior and executioner, sometimes in the same breath. Remedies were prescribed with confidence, though their effects were often poorly understood. Mercury was used liberally, believed to purge the body of disease, but it poisoned the gums, rotted the teeth, and slowly drove patients mad. Lead was ground into powders and mixed into tonics, despite its insidious effect on the nervous system. Opium tinctures were offered freely to soothe coughs, calm restless infants, and ease women's nerves, but dependence crept silently into households until it was too late. The apothecary's world was one where desperation collided with ignorance, and where lies, whether intentional or born of misplaced confidence, often had fatal consequences. Still, there was something magnetic about the apothecary's shop. It carried an atmosphere of possibility in an age when illness was omnipresent and cures were scarce. Life expectancy was short, epidemics swept through towns, and childhood mortality was tragically common. People lived in constant fear of fevers, consumption, and plagues they barely understood. Physicians were rare and costly, hospitals were few and terrifying, and so the apothecary became the place where hope could be purchased, bottled, and carried home. A mother might clutch a vial of laudanum to quiet her feverish child, while a laborer might pay his last coin for a tonic to ease the pain in his lungs. Whether these remedies healed or harmed, the exchange itself provided a momentary comfort, the illusion that something could be done against the vast, unknowable power of disease. The apothecary himself, standing behind the counter in his apron, mortar in hand, occupied a peculiar position of respect and suspicion. He was trusted because he seemed knowledgeable, and yet whispered rumors always followed the trade. People said that apothecaries watered down their tinctures, that they mixed cheaper substitutes into their powders, that they cared more for profit than for healing. There were tales of apothecaries selling the same miracle cure to every customer who walked in the door, regardless of their symptoms. Some accused them of being little more than quacks with better branding, while others swore by their skill, claiming that only the apothecary's steady hand had pulled them back from death. In truth, the apothecary's world was built as much on trust and reputation as it was on the substances he sold. This delicate balance was sustained by a web of secrecy. Recipes were closely guarded, passed from master to apprentice with great care, for they were the lifeblood of the trade. A rival could not be allowed to replicate a prized elixir. Many compounds bore names that evoked mystery Venetian treacle, mithridate, or theriac, each a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients, prepared with rituals that seemed half magical, half medical. Customers believed in the power of these concoctions, not because they understood them, but because they wanted to. In an uncertain world, the apothecary's bottles offered certainty in liquid form. This was the essence of the apothecary's power, to transform the unknown into something that could be swallowed, rubbed on the skin, or inhaled, giving the illusion of control over fate. But beneath the surface, the apothecary's world was riddled with contradictions. It claimed to heal, but often harmed. It claimed knowledge, but often relied on guesswork and tradition. It provided access to medicine, but was itself a marketplace, driven by the need to make a living, to sell, to keep the shelves stocked with exotic ingredients that impressed the customer as much as they treated the patient. In this tension, the apothecary's world reveals something essential about human history. Our deep, unyielding hunger for remedies, our willingness to believe in cures, even when evidence is scarce, and the thin line between medicine and poison. To walk into an apothecary's shop was to walk into the drama of human hope and human folly. Here was a place where life and death were measured in drops and doses, where lies could be sold as easily as truths, and where the glimmering promise of relief kept people coming back again and again, no matter how many times they left with their pockets lighter and their bodies no better. The apothecary's world was a world of contradictions, but above all, it was a world that thrived because human beings, then as now, would do almost anything to be free of pain, to escape death, or to find even the faintest glimmer of health in a bottle. The trade of the apothecary existed in a twilight realm, neither entirely within the bright halls of science, nor fully sunk into the dim caves of superstition. It was a profession born of necessity, nourished by curiosity, and shaped by secrecy, a trade between medicine and mystery in every sense of the phrase. To the outside observer, the apothecary's world promised answers to the most pressing fears of the human condition: disease, suffering, and death. But behind the polished jars and labeled drawers, there lay a far more complicated reality. Remedies were concocted from ingredients that carried both promise and peril. Practices were steeped in a blend of empirical observation and untested tradition. Customers never truly knew whether they were receiving a dose of healing or of poison. It was this uncertainty, this space between what was known and what was hoped for, that defined the apothecary's trade and allowed it to flourish for centuries. To understand why people trusted the apothecaries so implicitly, one must consider the world in which they lived. Illness was omnipresent, and explanations for disease were elusive. Germ theory was centuries away from gaining acceptance, so sickness was explained through the lens of humors, spirits, divine punishment, or the corruption of the air. The physician, with his expensive university education and lofty theories, might prescribe a treatment, but few common people could afford his services. Surgeons dealt with broken bones and battlefield wounds, but they too were often out of reach or distrusted for their crude methods. The apothecary occupied a middle ground, a figure who seemed approachable, practical, and affordable. His shop was not cloistered in ivory towers or adorned with academic degrees, but stood in the heart of town, its windows displaying the tangible promise of cures. People could see the jars, smell the herbs, and watch the powders being mixed before their eyes. This tangibility made the apothecary's remedies feel real in a way that abstract medical theory could not. And yet, this accessibility was also deceptive. The jars and powders gave the impression of mastery, but the knowledge underpinning them was often fragmentary. Recipes were inherited rather than proven, their supposed effects passed down from antiquity through a chain of repetition rather than experimentation. The very names of the remedies hinted at their roots in mystery. Theriac, mithridate, Venice treacle, ancient concoctions meant to ward off poison or plague, each containing dozens of ingredients, some rare and costly, others common and inert. To drink such a mixture was to participate in a ritual as much as a treatment, a gesture of faith as much as an act of healing. The apothecary was not merely dispensing medicine. He was selling belief in the possibility of recovery, belief that illness could be mastered if only the right balance of substances was struck. At the heart of this trade between medicine and mystery were the ingredients themselves, substances that straddled the line between cure and curse. Mercury gleamed with its quicksilver allure, flowing like liquid life in the apothecary's hand. It was prescribed for everything from syphilis to melancholy, on the theory that its ability to purge and sweat out illness was proof of its efficacy. And yet mercury corroded the body from within, causing drooling, tooth loss, tremors, and madness. Lead, too, was ground into powders or used in ointments, thought to have cooling or calming properties, though it slowly poisoned the nervous system. Arsenic was given in small doses for fevers, its toxicity carefully ignored or underestimated. Opium was the most seductive of all, an ingredient that truly did relieve pain and induce blissful sleep, but at the cost of dependence that few could escape once the habit was formed. These substances were not mere curiosities. They were at the center of the apothecary's trade, and their dual nature, both helpful and harmful, ensured that the apothecary would always dwell in that ambiguous space between healer and deceiver. And yet, even as they traded in mystery, apothecaries could not entirely escape the march of progress. By the 18th and 19th centuries, chemistry was beginning to peel back the layers of tradition. Experiments revealed that some remedies were inert or dangerous, while others contained active compounds that could genuinely heal. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, proved effective against malaria. Digitalis, from foxglove, showed powerful effects on the heart. Gradually, medicine began to separate from magic, and the apothecary found himself at a crossroads. Some embraced this new knowledge, transforming into pharmacists with an increasingly scientific foundation for their craft. Others resisted, clinging to the mystique that had long sustained their trade. The conflict between medicine and mystery played out not only in laboratories and universities, but in the crowded shops where ordinary people sought relief from their everyday pains. The tension was heightened by the commercial nature of the apothecary's work. Unlike physicians, who charged for consultations, apothecaries earned their living by selling goods. Their survival depended on the appeal of their remedies, and so there was always an incentive to exaggerate their virtues or to invent new concoctions that sounded more potent than they were. The line between healer and merchant was blurred, and this fueled both suspicion and dependency. Customers might grumble that the apothecary was charging too much, but they kept returning, unable to resist the promise of relief in a bottle. The trade was sustained not only by knowledge or mystery, but also by profit, and this entanglement of money with medicine deepened the ambiguity at the heart of the apothecary's profession. The apothecary's role in society also reflected this duality. He was a figure of trust, someone people turned to in times of desperation, but also a target of scorn when treatments failed or deaths followed. There were trials and scandals when apothecaries were accused of negligence or fraud, cases where their mixtures killed rather than cured. At the same time, there were countless stories of people swearing that only the apothecary's remedy had saved them. The truth lay somewhere in between, shaped as much by the psychology of hope as by the pharmacology of the ingredients. The trade thrived on this ambiguity, for as long as people believed there was a chance of healing, they would continue to seek out the apothecary's wares. The trade between medicine and mystery, then, was not an accidental byproduct of ignorance. It was the very foundation of the apothecary's world. Mystery gave weight to medicine, made it seem more powerful than it often was. Medicine gave mystery a veneer of respectability, allowing superstition and commerce to masquerade as science. Together, they created a system that endured for centuries, adapting slowly as true scientific breakthroughs emerged, but never fully relinquishing the aura of secrecy and wonder that made it compelling. Even today, echoes of this trade persist in the popularity of alternative medicines, herbal tonics, and miracle cures sold with more promise than proof. The apothecary may have vanished, replaced by the modern pharmacist, but the human hunger for remedies that balance knowledge with mystery has never disappeared. Lead was everywhere, so common and unremarkable in the world of the apothecary that few ever thought to question it. The soft, gray metal that could be molded with ease, ground to powder, or dissolved into sweet-tasting compounds had slipped silently into medicines, cosmetics, wines, and even the water that ran through pipes. For centuries, lead was a substance of trust, a material with history stretching back to Rome itself, when aqueducts carried water through leaden channels, and physicians prescribed lead salts as astringents to bind the body and calm inflammation. By the time the apothecary shops of Europe bustled with clinking jars and bottles, lead was not seen as dangerous, but as useful, versatile, and strangely comforting. Few substances could match its power to dry, to staunch, to sweeten, to preserve. That it poisoned the very bodies it was meant to heal was a truth that lurked in shadows, spoken only when its effects became too grotesque to deny. And even then, denial persisted, for profit and tradition wove a tight cloak around lead's reputation. Apothecaries prized lead for its ability to constrict. In an age when medicine was obsessed with balance, with excess humor spilling into fever or flux, lead seemed to have a miraculous effect on the body. Dissolved into syrups or ground into powders, it dried up diarrhea, slowed bleeding, and dulled pain. To the healer who measured success not in longevity, but in immediate relief, this was proof of efficacy. Patients came with their bellies churning, their bowels unrelenting, and after swallowing a draught laced with lead acetate, commonly called sugar of lead for its crystalline sweetness, they found their agony stilled. Mothers gave it to children. Soldiers consumed it on campaign. The poor purchased it in small doses, hoping for respite. They did not know that while it calmed their suffering, it also infiltrated their bones, their blood, their brains, leaving behind a legacy of convulsions, madness, and early graves. The paradox of lead was that it often worked in the short term. In a world without antibiotics, without modern surgery, without understanding of microbes, the immediate effect of a medicine was everything. The apothecary who sold a syrup that quelled dysentery was praised as skilled, even if his patient later weakened with mysterious seizures or paralysis. The woman whose bleeding stopped after swallowing a lead draught gave thanks for her survival, not realizing that the tremors in her hands and the decline of her memory were born of the same substance that saved her. The poison hid within the cure, and the cure disguised the poison. Lead was not confined to medicines. It was everywhere in daily life, blurring the line between healing and harm. Cosmetics made with white lead promised a luminous complexion, masking blemishes under a chalky veneer that slowly ate into the skin. Wine was often adulterated with lead compounds to enhance sweetness and preserve flavor, a practice carried on since antiquity. Pewter cups, glazed pottery, and leaden pipes leached their invisible toxins into every sip of water and every bite of food. Thus, when apothecaries reached for lead as a medicinal ingredient, few raised eyebrows. If everyone lived surrounded by it, was it not simply part of life? But the evidence of suffering was impossible to erase. Families whispered of children who grew pale, their bellies swollen, their limbs weakened by mysterious palsies. Housewives noticed that their cosmetics, instead of preserving youth, led to sores and scars that deepened with time. Workers in lead mines or pottery workshops trembled and staggered, their bodies betraying them with every passing year. And yet, when these symptoms reached the apothecary's ear, he often mistook them for other ailments, or worse still, prescribed more lead to counteract them. For what was lead poisoning but a set of ailments that resembled other diseases, stomach pains, weakness, nervous fits, and madness? In a medical world that lacked precision, the poison's own disguise shielded it from suspicion. The apothecary's shelves gleamed with jars of lead-based powders, oils, and plasters. Sugar of lead was one of the most prized, its sweetness deceptive, its crystals resembling those of benign sugar. Applied externally, lead compounds soothed ulcers and burns. Internally, they were believed to check hemorrhage, ease fevers, and calm inflammation. Lead ointments were rubbed into sores, lead plasters wrapped around wounds, and lead-laced draughts swallowed with hope. Each preparation carried the same quiet doom. Once inside the body, lead was not easily expelled. It lingered, binding itself into bone, leaching into blood, disrupting the delicate workings of nerves and organs. To swallow lead was to carry it forever. Some physicians began to notice patterns, though their voices were often drowned by tradition. Reports circulated of Devonshire colic, a mysterious illness in cider-drinking regions of England, later traced to lead leaching from presses. Painters were struck with painter's colic, a wasting disease from the lead in their pigments. These scattered observations hinted at a truth. Lead was a hidden destroyer. Yet apothecaries, committed to their trade and profits, resisted the conclusion. How could the very substance they prescribed daily, the very material that offered them reputation and livelihood, be an agent of death? To admit as much was to indict themselves. And so they doubled down, defending lead as medicine even as its victims multiplied. The damage to children was especially cruel. Lead poisoning stunted growth, dulled intellect, and warped development. Yet in an era when infant mortality was high and childhood illness common, such effects were rarely recognized for what they were. A child wasting away was seen as fragile, unfortunate, or cursed, not as poisoned. Families who trusted their apothecaries continued to administer lead-laced syrups, believing them beneficial. A bitter irony played out in countless homes. Parents, desperate to save their children, unknowingly delivered poison with each spoonful. The graves of infants and young children became silent testimony to Leed's treachery. The apothecaries themselves were not immune. Those who handled powders daily inhaled the dust. Those who prepared ointments absorbed it through their skin. Over time, they too developed trembling hands, faltering memories, darkened gums, and constant pain. Yet they, like their patients, rarely recognized the source. Some chalked it up to age, others to the burdens of work, never seeing that the very jars they measured from were slowly eroding their own bodies. It was not until the rise of modern chemistry and toxicology in the 18th and 19th centuries that the veil began to lift. Scientists began to isolate the effects of lead, conducting experiments and documenting symptoms that matched case after case. It proved what generations had endured without explanation. That lead was not healing, but poisoning, not salvation, but betrayal. Medical journals published warnings, and reformers called for restrictions. But still, the transition was slow. Tradition dies hard, and the apothecaries who had built reputations on lead resisted change. Some argued that only excessive doses were harmful, that careful administration remained safe. Others simply ignored the growing evidence, preferring profit and habit to uncomfortable truth. The legacy of lead in medicine is one of the starkest warnings history offers. Its effects were not subtle. The convulsions, madness, and deaths were plain, yet the illusion of cure blinded generations to its danger. It reminds us how powerfully tradition and trust can override evidence, how easily desperation can silence doubt. Patients wanted relief, apothecaries wanted to provide it, and in the space between, lead thrived as both cure and killer. In the end, lead left scars not only on bodies, but on trust itself. The revelations of its toxicity helped fuel skepticism toward apothecaries and traditional medicine, paving the way for stricter scientific standards, regulations, and professional accountability. But the price had been incalculable. Countless lives shortened, countless families haunted by illnesses whose true cause they never understood. Lead, once the apothecary's ally, became a symbol of medicine's capacity to harm when ignorance, profit, and misplaced faith hold sway. It is remembered now not as a cure, but as a caution, a reminder that what is administered in the name of healing must always be tested against truth, not cloaked in tradition. The shelves of the apothecary promised salvation. Rows of glass jars, carefully labeled in neat handwriting, stood like silent guardians of health and healing. To the desperate patient, they represented hope. A spoonful of liquid, a pinch of powder, or a pellet slipped under the tongue might mean relief from fever, the end of tormenting coughs, the easing of gnawing pain. Yet for so many who walked through those doors, clutching their coin and their faith, what they carried home was not a cure, but a slow descent into suffering, dependence, or death. The tragedy of the apothecary's world is not only in the deception or the false promises, but in the countless ordinary lives shattered under the weight of those promises. The patients who paid the price were mothers trying to soothe their crying children, men too exhausted from labor to resist an easy tonic, women told their nerves would settle with a few drops, and the poor who spent their last coins on poisons packaged as miracles. Consider the mother with her infant, the baby shrieking through the night with swollen gums from teething. She came to the apothecary, weary and desperate, and was handed a small packet of teething powders. They were white, fine, and odorless, easy to mix into milk. The powders contained calomel, a form of mercury. The first doses seemed miraculous. The baby stopped crying, drifted into quiet sleep. Relief washed over the mother. For the first time in weeks, her house was silent. But as the days stretched into weeks, the child grew weak. His cheeks hollowed, his gums began to recede, and his small body seemed to shrink. The powders had not eased his pain. They had poisoned him slowly, eroding his health until he was pale and still. To the grieving mother, it was a mystery, but to us looking back, it is clear. She had trusted the apothecary, and the price had been her child's life. Adults fared little better. Lead was laced through countless remedies, from cough syrups to digestive powders. It dulled pain in the short term, numbing inflamed nerves and calming upset stomachs. A man racked by chronic stomach cramps, perhaps a dock worker or factory hand, might have taken such a powder nightly to allow himself the strength to rise at dawn and return to work. He would have sworn by it, even recommended it to others. Yet in time, his hands would begin to shake, his bowels would seize, and his mind would wander into confusion and rage. Lead poisoning stripped away health by inches, transforming strong men into shells of themselves. By the time families realized something was wrong, the damage was irreversible. The apothecary might nod solemnly, sell them another powder, and continue the cycle. Opium was, in many ways, the most tragic gift and curse. In the form of laudanum, it flowed from apothecary counters into nearly every household. For the poor, it was cheaper than a doctor and more reliable than prayer. Mothers dosed their infants to keep them quiet while they worked. Laborers swallowed it for aching joints. Women took it to numb the invisible weight of despair, loneliness, or what the Victorians called hysteria. In the first hours after a dose, the world seemed softer. Pain dulled, hunger quieted, tears dried. But dependence grew swiftly, and soon a life revolved around the next dose. Infants who survived opium syrups often grew weak and sickly. Adults became hollow-eyed and haunted, their days blurred by the fog of addiction. Families collapsed under its weight, not just from the expense, but from the unraveling of human bonds, as loved ones lost themselves to the drug that had promised relief. The wealthy were not immune. Fashionable households ordered exotic tonics advertised in newspapers, often shipped with ornate labels and fine bottles. Behind the elegance, the same poisons lurked. Aristocratic women addicted to laudanum might waste away in drawing rooms, their illnesses whispered about as delicate constitutions. Men of high station drank Mercury cures for venereal disease, believing themselves cleansed while their bodies rotted within. Illness did not discriminate, and neither did the poisons only the rich could afford more of them. Their suffering stretched over years instead of months. What deepens the tragedy is the trust that underpinned these transactions. Patients looked into the apothecary's eyes and believed. In a world with little access to true medical science, the apothecary's word was gospel. To challenge, it required knowledge ordinary people did not have, and courage they rarely could summon when illness was pressing on their shoulders. Many never suspected the remedies themselves. They blamed fate, weakness of the body, or God's will. Families buried their children, believing they had done all they could. Men died thinking their bodies had betrayed them, not knowing the betrayal lay in the powders and potions they swallowed nightly. The stories repeat, each one laced with quiet devastation. A seamstress working long hours under candlelight takes drops of a tonic for her headaches. The tonic is laced with morphine, and soon she cannot function without it. A miner plagued by chest coughs takes a syrup that soothes his lungs, but eats away at his brain with lead. A child born frail is fed calomel powders, his parents reassured by the apothecary that they are strengthening him, only to watch him waste away. Each death, each ruined life, stands as a silent testimony to a system that allowed poisons to masquerade as medicine. And yet, these patients were not only victims of chemistry, they were victims of their own hope. Suffering makes people cling to any promise, however thin. The apothecaries knew this. They spoke gently, with confidence, selling not just a powder or a bottle, but a dream of relief. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to condemn the buyers as naive. But in their time, medicine was a mystery, the body a puzzle few could understand. To walk into the apothecary's shop and place your coins on the counter was an act of faith, and faith can make even poison taste like salvation until the truth arrived too late. The patients who paid the price were countless, their names mostly lost to history. They were not kings or generals, not figures whose lives were recorded in books. They were mothers and children, workers and widows, families clinging to survival. Their suffering unfolded quietly in homes and sickbeds, in alleyways and workhouses, in cottages and manors alike. They remind us that the story of medicine is not only the story of progress, but also of error, greed, and the immense cost borne by those with the least power to resist. The apothecary's jars may have promised cures, but inside them were tragedies waiting to be written into flesh and bone. The greatest tragedy is how ordinary it all was. This was not the story of a few isolated victims, but of generations. Entire communities relied on remedies that harmed more than they healed. In villages, laudanum was as common as bread. In cities, lead-based cosmetics and mercury powders passed from hand to hand. The suffering was normalized, folded into daily life as though it were inevitable. It would take decades of science, scandal, and reform before the truth pierced through. But for the patients who paid the price, there was no undoing what had already been swallowed, no reversing what had already seeped into their blood. Their hope was their undoing, their trust their death sentence. And in that lies the cruelest irony. They sought healing, and in their quest, they found ruin. The relationship between the apothecary and the physician was a delicate tension, one born of necessity, pride, and profit, yet often strained to the breaking point by rivalry. In the cities and towns of Europe, the apothecary's shop stood as both complement and competitor to the physician's consulting room. Where the physician diagnosed, the apothecary dispensed. Where the physician prescribed, the apothecary filled the order. Yet beneath this apparent harmony lay resentment and competition. Apothecaries saw physicians as aloof, often disdainful men, cloistered in their learned chambers, writing prescriptions that required their expertise, but offering little recognition or respect. Physicians, in turn, regarded apothecaries as tradesmen, skilled in the mixing of herbs, but lacking the intellectual rigor to understand disease itself. This rivalry was not merely professional. It was existential, a battle over authority, status, and control over life itself. And the patients were caught in the middle, sometimes benefiting, often suffering from the clash. Apothecaries prided themselves on the practical knowledge they accumulated through years of handling substances, observing effects, and listening to the stories of their clients. They knew how the body reacted to different powders and tinctures, how opium calmed the anxious, how mercury eased skin ailments, and how lead dulled pain but eroded vitality over time. Their expertise was earned in the crucible of experience rather than in universities, which often excluded the lower classes entirely. This hands-on wisdom allowed them to see what physicians confined to theory sometimes missed. A mother seeking a remedy for a child's persistent cough might receive a carefully measured syrup from the apothecary, adjusted subtly for age or weight, whereas the physician's formula might be rigid, impractical, or prohibitively expensive. Yet this same skill exposed them to criticism. Apothecaries were accused of practicing medicine without a license, of dabbling in the lives of patients without sufficient understanding, of overstepping their bounds, and tempting fate with substances that could heal or harm with equal ease. Physicians, meanwhile, wielded the authority of letters and diplomas, a knowledge enshrined in Latin texts, statutes, and guild rules. They condemned apothecaries for their improvisation, for what they called the vulgar mixing of remedies without understanding disease. A physician's prestige came from centuries of intellectual tradition, and any encroachment by a tradesman threatened a carefully guarded hierarchy. Laws and regulations often reflected this tension. In many cities, apothecaries were forbidden from diagnosing. They could compound and sell, but the authority to name a disease, to claim it understood its progression, remained a physician's monopoly. Apothecaries chafed under these restrictions. They saw themselves as practical healers, essential to everyday life, yet constantly reminded that their work was secondary in the eyes of learned men. The rivalry was also economic. Physicians, particularly those with wealthy clientele, depended on the services of apothecaries for the preparation of their prescriptions. Yet apothecaries often attempted to expand their clientele, offering remedies directly to patients without referral. This undercut physicians' authority and revenue, and resentment grew. Complaints were lodged with municipal authorities, guilds debated regulations, and pamphlets circulated, warning the public that apothecaries might poison them if left unchecked. Some physicians accused apothecaries of greed, claiming that they sold cures not to heal, but to profit from suffering. Apothecaries responded with their own accusations, insisting that physicians hoarded knowledge and overcharged for consultations that were inaccessible to the poor. The conflict was rarely a simple dispute over money. It was about who controlled access to health, who could claim legitimacy, and who would be entrusted with the fragile lives of ordinary people. Patients, naturally, found themselves in a precarious position. A family might visit a physician and receive a prescription for a complex combination of powders, syrups, and tinctures. The apothecary, obliged to fill it precisely, sometimes found errors in the formula or ingredients that were unavailable. Some apothecaries took liberties, substituting what they judged safer or more effective, adjusting dosages according to experience rather than strict prescription. Physicians saw this as heresy, apothecaries as necessary discretion. In other cases, patients bypassed physicians entirely, seeking remedies directly from apothecaries who promised faster, cheaper, or more effective solutions. Successes were quietly celebrated. Failures, carefully blamed on patient weakness, fate, or the limits of science. The ambiguity of outcomes only heightened the tension between the two professions. The rivalry also extended to public perception. Physicians often relied on scholarly writings, treatises, and formal networks to assert their authority. Apothecaries, on the other hand, depended on reputation built in the marketplace. Word of mouth mattered, as did visible skill in mixing, knowledge of herbs, and the appearance of care. An apothecary who could soothe a child, ease a fever, or calm a trembling patient earned loyalty that was difficult to counter with academic credentials alone. Yet the power of the physician's title carried weight in courts, councils, and guilds. When disputes arose, the law often sided with the learned men, yet the daily realities of illness, poverty, and access ensured that apothecaries retained a critical role in society. Underlying all of this was a philosophical divide. Physicians embraced humoral theory, believing that disease arose from imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments were theoretically calculated to restore equilibrium, often through diet, purging, or bleeding. Apothecaries, meanwhile, worked from observation, intuition, and experience. They focused on alleviating symptoms and easing suffering, sometimes experimenting with combinations of herbs and minerals whose effects were poorly understood. This difference in approach fueled the rivalry. Physicians criticized apothecaries for superstitious practices and for meddling with forces beyond comprehension. Apothecaries criticized physicians for impracticality, for ignoring the suffering before them while theorizing about invisible healers. In many ways, the patient became a testing ground, a battleground upon which these conflicting philosophies played out. Competition was not uniform. In some cases, physicians and apothecaries collaborated. A skilled apothecary could execute a physician's prescriptions with precision, and in return, the physician's recommendations lent legitimacy to the apothecary's work. But collaboration was uneasy, and the boundaries of power were constantly tested. Disputes over fees, formulations, and patient care could erupt into public quarrels. Court cases occasionally arose when an apothecary's substitution was deemed negligent, or when a patient's death brought scrutiny. These moments illustrate the high stakes. Behind the polite smiles and polished counters, each profession guarded authority with vigilance, and every error carried consequences for both patients and practitioners. The rivalry reached its peak during times of crisis. Epidemics, sudden outbreaks of disease, and shortages of ingredients exposed weaknesses in the system. Physicians demanded obedience. Apothecaries adapted creatively, compounding what they could and improvising when supplies failed. Patients were caught in the middle, often grateful for apothecary resourcefulness while resenting the cost or fearing the physician's judgment. The crisis of need often demonstrated the interdependence of the two professions, even as it inflamed the underlying competition. It was a dance of cooperation and rivalry, survival and profit, authority and skill. Beyond the city, in rural communities, the apothecary often served as the primary healthcare provider, while physicians remained distant, expensive, or inaccessible. Here, rivalry took on a different tone. The apothecary's role was elevated, his skill unquestioned by those with no alternative. Yet when physicians arrived in these areas, either temporarily or through referral, tension flared. Apothecaries resented intrusion. Physicians resented perceived overreach. The stakes were not only professional pride, but the literal health of the community. Misdiagnoses, harmful substitutions, or errors in dosing could devastate lives. The rivalry was personal and immediate, no longer abstract. Ultimately, the rivalry between apothecaries and physicians shaped the evolution of medicine. It highlighted gaps in knowledge, emphasized the importance of skill and observation, and forced both parties to defend, clarify, and occasionally innovate in their practice. Patients bore the brunt of the conflicts, yet in the friction, there were moments of progress. The competition pushed apothecaries to refine their methods, to better understand their remedies, and sometimes to collaborate with physicians when circumstances demanded. The tension was uncomfortable, fraught with risk, but it contributed to a slow evolution toward a more systematic and careful approach to healing. In the end, the counter, the consultation room, the jars and bottles were all stages on which a larger struggle played out. Authority versus experience, theory versus practice, trust versus skepticism. The rivalry with physicians was not merely a professional spat. It was the crucible in which early modern medicine was forged. Patients paid with their health, with their lives. Yet through these conflicts, the boundaries of medical knowledge were drawn more clearly, and the apothecary's craft emerged with both its triumphs and tragedies immortalized in the history of healing. For centuries, apothecaries, quacks, and physicians had operated in a world of partial knowledge, tradition, and belief, where remedies were as likely to harm as to heal. The dark streets, crowded markets, and dimly lit shops echoed with the desperate pleas of patients and the confident assurances of those who sold them bottles of hope. Mercury, lead, and opium flowed freely, promising relief while exacting a hidden toll. But eventually, the world began to shift. Science, slow and methodical, began to challenge centuries of custom, superstition, and untested practice. Laboratories replaced whispers, observation supplanted guesswork, and evidence, however fragile at first, began to confront the lies behind the counter. The fight was neither swift nor clean. It was gradual, a creeping illumination that threatened those who had long profited from obscurity and uncertainty. Those who had long been at the mercy of blind tradition suddenly faced the cold clarity of experiment, measurement, and reproducibility, and the results were transformative, even if often ignored at first. The earliest scientists approached medicine not with the air of certainty that characterized the apothecary or the theatrical flair of the quack, but with a painstaking curiosity. They observed the effects of substances on the human body, on animals, on simple chemical reactions. Experiments were conducted slowly, methodically, with careful notation of dose, reaction, and outcome. Mercury was no longer just a tool of ritual or tradition. Its toxic properties could be documented. Lead, so long regarded as harmless when processed into powders, revealed its slow, destructive effects on the brain, the kidneys, and the blood. Opium's capacity to dull pain became a double-edged sword. Relief came at the cost of dependence. Through repeated observation, scientists began to establish principles that would challenge centuries of entrenched practice. They questioned authority and insisted on evidence, creating a culture of skepticism that undermined centuries of unchecked claims. Patients began to see small but profound changes. Apothecaries who had once dispensed powders without understanding were forced to confront scientific findings that contradicted their routines. Some adapted, slowly refining their formulations, discarding the most harmful substances, and measuring doses with greater precision. Physicians, long reliant on humoral theory and prescription from texts, found their authority tested not only by empirical evidence, but by the rise of specialized pharmacology. The balance of power shifted incrementally. Those who ignored the lessons of observation found themselves increasingly at odds with the emerging standards of care. Their reputations weakened and their trade scrutinized by both regulators and the educated public. Regulation followed knowledge. Governments, recognizing both the social and economic costs of harm caused by untested remedies, began to legislate. Apothecaries were required to follow codified standards, to measure ingredients accurately, and to maintain records of their formulations. Quacks were outlawed or restricted, their performances curtailed, their claims subjected to scrutiny. Licensing systems emerged, establishing formal qualifications for practice and creating an incentive for practitioners to align with scientific principles. It was a slow, uneven process, resisted at every turn by those who benefited from opacity and tradition, but the tide was inexorable. Science, with its insistence on evidence, transparency, and reproducibility, began to define legitimacy in medicine, displacing the old hierarchies of persuasion, authority, and spectacle. The fight was not only technical, but also cultural. Patients, accustomed to trusting appearances, gestures, and promises, had to learn to interpret evidence, to understand risk, and to question authority. This transition was uneven. The allure of miracle cures persisted, and skepticism did not always protect the vulnerable. Yet the dissemination of knowledge through pamphlets, lectures, and eventually newspapers allowed a broader public to grasp basic principles of hygiene, dosing, and toxicology. People began to recognize the difference between genuine remedies and substances that promised relief while causing harm. Even modest improvements in patient awareness had profound effects, gradually reducing the toll exacted by centuries of ignorance and deception. Scientific methods illuminated not only the dangers of certain substances, but also the limits of previous assumptions. Mercury and lead, once administered liberally in pursuit of cure, were now understood in the context of dosage and toxicity. Experiments with opium revealed both its analgesic potential and its risk of addiction. Observation and repetition allowed patterns to emerge, patterns that had been invisible to generations of apothecaries and patients. Those who embraced these insights could refine practice and reduce harm, while those who resisted faced declining trust and growing regulation. Science did not act in isolation. It required documentation, communication, and the willingness to challenge tradition. The cumulative effect was a slow erosion of the culture that had long allowed mercury, lead, and opium to be distributed freely without understanding or accountability. Even as science advanced, the struggle was ongoing. Established practitioners, comfortable with custom and authority, sometimes resisted new methods, claiming experience over theory. Patients, fearful and desperate, sometimes clung to the familiar remedies of apothecaries and quacks. The battle was therefore as much about perception and education as it was about laboratory results. Demonstrating harm in a controlled experiment did not immediately persuade the populace or practitioners. The dissemination of understanding required patience, repetition, and visible success in healing. Each recovered patient, each avoided poisoning, became evidence in the public sphere, slowly eroding the entrenched culture of dangerous remedies. Through this transition, heroes emerged: scientists who documented poisonings, reformers who advocated for legislation, physicians and apothecaries who adapted their methods in light of evidence. They tested, recorded, and published, creating the foundation for modern pharmacology and toxicology. Their work revealed the consequences of untested substances, providing both warning and guidance. Patients who previously relied on hope now had access to information, measurements, and protocols that could genuinely alleviate suffering. Mistakes still occurred, but they were increasingly understood, explained, and mitigated, rather than hidden behind performance, authority, or illusion. By the mid-19th century, the combination of observation, experimentation, and regulation had reshaped the medical landscape. The culture of unchecked remedies, spectacle, and deceit was supplanted gradually by a culture of responsibility, transparency, and evidence-based practice. Patients, though still vulnerable, now had pathways to safety. Apothecaries who adapted thrived in this new system, while charlatans and quacks found it harder to survive under scrutiny. The era of mercury, lead, and unmeasured opium did not end overnight, but the foundations of modern medicine were laid as science fought back, illuminating truth where shadows had long prevailed, protecting the vulnerable, and demanding accountability from those who dispensed remedies. In the end, the story of science fighting back is the story of perseverance, observation, and courage in the face of centuries of error. It is a testament to the power of methodical inquiry over spectacle, to evidence over persuasion, and to the slow, steady march of knowledge as it reshapes the world. The patients who had once paid the price, knowingly or unknowingly, were the silent witnesses to a transformation that would eventually make medicine safer, more precise, and more humane. Their suffering, recorded in observations and experiments, became the foundation of reform, and the lessons learned continue to echo in the ethics, practice, and regulations of medicine today. For centuries, apothecaries, quacks, and self-styled healers had enjoyed the trust of the desperate and the unquestioning. They worked behind their wooden counters with jars of bright powders, bottles of mysterious tinctures, and bundles of herbs that seemed to promise relief for every ailment. To the sick and the poor, they were indispensable. But as science began to expose the hidden dangers in their wares, and as the bodies of poisoned patients piled up, the tide of public opinion slowly began to turn. What had once been tolerated as custom and necessity became a source of anger, suspicion, and eventual revolt. The public backlash was not sudden. It grew gradually, nurtured by grief, betrayal, and the slow realization that much of what they had been given in the name of medicine was, in fact, poison. The backlash began with whispers. Families who had lost loved ones after a course of treatment began to talk. They compared stories of powders that blackened the gums, of pills that dulled pain but left the body ravaged, of children who had been dosed with calming syrups only to waste away in their cradles. In taverns, marketplaces, and churchyards, these accounts spread, amplified by sorrow and outrage. As literacy spread and newspapers became a force of daily life, these whispers turned into print. Pamphlets condemned greedy apothecaries and quacks who sold hope in bottles, laced with mercury and lead. Writers described ruined lives, addicted souls, and fortunes drained by miracle cures that cured nothing. The spectacle of medicine, once the province of wonder and awe, was recast as fraud and cruelty. It was not only the deaths that drove outrage, but the lies. Patients discovered that the men they had trusted had concealed knowledge of harm, that they had exaggerated the virtues of their concoctions while ignoring the consequences. The realization that trust had been betrayed ignited fury in a way that mere failure could not. Failure might be tolerated in medicine, where uncertainty was understood, but deception was another matter. To be poisoned while being promised health was an offense that could not be forgiven. The sense of betrayal united the poor, who had suffered the worst, with reform-minded elites who began to demand accountability. As the backlash grew, it took on different forms depending on class and community. Among the poor, resistance often meant avoiding certain apothecaries, spreading warnings about specific remedies, or confronting quacks in public. Among the middle and upper classes, the backlash took shape in petitions, debates in Parliament, and pressure on the medical establishment to regulate or abolish dangerous practices. Newspapers thrived on sensational accounts of poisonings, ruined families, and courtroom dramas where apothecaries were forced to defend their practices. Public anger became a spectacle in itself, feeding into a broader culture of distrust toward those who claimed authority without evidence. Riots occasionally broke out when anger reached its peak. There are accounts of shops being vandalized, of bottles smashed in the streets, of apothecaries chased from their neighborhoods by furious crowds who had grown tired of burying their children. These were not common, but they were powerful symbols of how deeply resentment had taken root. The apothecary's shop, once a place of community reliance, became in some towns a target of suspicion, even hatred. The figure of the kindly healer was recast in the public imagination as a profiteer, a liar, or even a killer in disguise. The backlash was fueled further by the contrast between the promises of the apothecaries and the rising clarity of scientific evidence. When scientists began to demonstrate, with experiments and publications, that mercury destroyed organs, that lead corroded the mind, and that opium enslaved its users, the public saw confirmation of what their grief and suspicion had already told them. Every new scientific paper became another weapon in the hands of those who demanded change. Where apothecaries had once brushed off complaints as accidents or rare misfortunes, they now faced hard evidence that their remedies were harmful by nature. The authority of science gave the public's anger legitimacy, making it harder for defenders of tradition to dismiss outrage as ignorance. The backlash also had a moral and religious dimension. Preachers began to condemn the greed of those who sold deadly substances under the guise of healing. Sermons spoke of apothecaries and quacks as modern Pharisees, hypocrites who profited from human suffering. This moral framing resonated with congregations already familiar with the themes of sin, temptation, and betrayal. Addiction to opium was described as a form of enslavement to vice, with the apothecary cast as the tempter. The rhetoric transformed what might have been seen as a technical problem of medicine into a moral crusade, giving ordinary people a sense of righteous purpose in demanding reform. The legal system began to feel the pressure. Courts were flooded with cases of malpractice, fraud, and wrongful death. Some apothecaries were prosecuted, though many escaped with fines or light penalties. Still, each trial was a stage upon which the public's outrage could be aired, with grieving families testifying against men who had once been respected pillars of their communities. The courtroom became another theater of backlash, where trust was stripped away and reputations were destroyed under the gaze of journalists and spectators. Yet the backlash was not simple. Many still relied on apothecaries for daily ailments, and the same communities that rioted against quacks often continued to purchase their remedies. Outrage and dependence coexisted uneasily. People wanted reform, but still needed access to medicine, however imperfect. This tension prolonged the struggle, ensuring that the backlash was not a clean break, but a slow erosion of trust. The public demanded accountability, but was forced to balance anger with necessity. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect of decades of backlash was transformative. Apothecaries who survived did so by adapting. They distanced themselves from quackery, adopted scientific methods, and sought licenses that gave them legitimacy. Those who refused to change found themselves increasingly isolated, targeted by both regulators and angry neighbors. The quacks and charlatans who had once thrived in the unregulated marketplace, found their audiences shrinking, their reputations poisoned by scandal. Public anger had become a force that could shape markets, professions, and even laws. By the 19th century, the backlash had helped pave the way for formalized medical professions. The authority of apothecaries was broken, absorbed into the emerging discipline of pharmacy. The wild marketplace of miracle cures was increasingly constrained by regulation and by the memory of public fury. The backlash had done its work. It had destroyed blind trust and replaced it with a demand for accountability. The image of the apothecary, once benign, would forever be shattered by the memory of mercury-laced tonics, lead-based powders, and opium syrups that had ruined lives. The story of the public backlash is, in many ways, a story of awakening. It is the story of ordinary people who realized that their suffering was not inevitable, that they had been betrayed, and that they could demand change. It is a story of grief turned into anger, and of anger turned into reform. It is the story of how the silent victims of poison and addiction found their voice, and how that voice reshaped medicine itself. The apothecaries and quacks, who had once stood unchallenged behind their counters, now faced the full force of the people they had once deceived. The bottles and powders remained, but the illusion of unquestioned trust was gone forever. The apothecary shop, once a place of quiet commerce and whispered trust, began to transform in the public imagination into a theater of suspicion. The wooden counters that had long displayed jars of herbs, powders, and tinctures were suddenly seen as evidence tables, each vial and bottle a potential instrument of harm. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, as public backlash intensified and scientific knowledge exposed the dangers of mercury, lead, arsenic, and opium, apothecaries increasingly found themselves summoned not only to heal the sick, but to defend their practices before magistrates, judges, and juries. Trials became a crucible in which the clash between tradition and modernity, between secrecy and accountability, played out with devastating consequences for the profession. The earliest trials often arose from tragedy. A child dead after being dosed with a soothing syrup, a wife who wasted away after a tonic, a worker who collapsed from a restorative powder. Such cases brought grieving families into the courtroom, their pain sharpened by betrayal. These trials were not simply about medicine, but about trust. Jurors were asked to decide whether the apothecary had acted in ignorance, negligence, or outright fraud. For many ordinary citizens sitting in the jury box, the answer was shaped as much by the growing suspicion toward apothecaries as by the evidence presented. The courtrooms filled with spectators eager to see the once respected healer unmasked as a villain. The cases also revealed the complicated interplay between ignorance and deception. Some apothecaries truly did not know the dangers of their remedies. They relied on inherited recipes and long-established practices, convinced that if patients worsened, it was the will of God or the natural course of disease. Others, however, knowingly concealed the risks, motivated by profit and the demand for quick fixes. Trials often hinged on this distinction. Was the apothecary a fool or a fraud? A misguided traditionalist or a calculating predator? The line between the two was often blurred, leaving juries torn between sympathy and condemnation. One famous case in London involved an apothecary accused of killing a young girl with calomel, a mercury-based compound prescribed for stomach complaints. The child's gums blackened, her breath turned foul, and within days she was dead. The prosecution brought forward a physician who demonstrated, with scientific precision, how mercury corroded the body. The apothecary, in his defense, insisted that he had given the same treatment countless times with no ill effect. He broke down on the stand, swearing he had acted in good faith. The jury acquitted him, but the damage was done. The newspaper coverage painted him as careless at best, murderous at worst. His shop closed within months, his livelihood ruined, not by the verdict, but by public opinion. In other cases, the outcome was far harsher. Some apothecaries were fined heavily, others imprisoned. A few, particularly those accused of deliberate fraud or reckless distribution of addictive opium tinctures, faced the death penalty. While executions were rare, the threat of them hung over the profession, a reminder that the old protections of tradition and community respect could no longer shield apothecaries from the wrath of law. Each trial became a warning to others. Adapt, modernize, or risk the courtroom's unforgiving gaze. The trials also exposed the hypocrisy of society itself. Many of those who condemned apothecaries for selling addictive or toxic substances had themselves demanded such remedies. Mothers asked for calming syrups to quiet restless children. Workers begged for opium to dull their pains, and fashionable gentlemen sought powders to cure their excesses of drink and indulgence. When tragedy followed, it was easier to blame the apothecary than to acknowledge the culture of dependence that had grown around these substances. The courtroom thus became a stage upon which society projected its guilt, punishing the apothecary for fulfilling the very demands that kept his business alive. Still, the cumulative effect of these trials was undeniable. They accelerated reform. Each scandal added momentum to calls for regulation. Legislators, pushed by public outrage and emboldened by science, introduced new laws restricting the sale of poisons, requiring licenses for practitioners, and enforcing standards of education. Trials, in this sense, became the pivot between the chaotic marketplace of the past and the regulated profession of the future. The profession of pharmacy was born out of this crucible of accusation and defense, forged in the fires of courtroom battles. The personal toll on apothecaries was devastating. Some fled towns where they had once been pillars of the community, their reputations destroyed beyond repair. Others sank into poverty, unable to compete in a marketplace that now demanded not only knowledge, but proof of safety. A few reinvented themselves, embracing scientific learning and distancing their trade from the quackery that had fueled the trials. These survivors became the foundation of modern pharmacy, men who carried the scars of public suspicion, but also the determination to rebuild trust through evidence rather than tradition. The trials also left a cultural legacy. They became cautionary tales retold for decades, reminders of the dangers of blind trust and the perils of unregulated healing. Writers and satirists lampooned apothecaries in plays, novels, and cartoons, often portraying them as greedy tricksters brought low by justice. At the same time, reformers pointed to these cases as proof that progress was possible, that public anger could be transformed into legal protection. In this way, the apothecary on trial became not just a figure of shame, but also a symbol of society's growing demand for accountability. Perhaps most significantly, the spectacle of apothecaries on trial revealed the power of the ordinary public in shaping medicine. These were not cases driven solely by physicians or scientists, but by families, neighbors, and jurors who demanded answers. Their voices, once confined to whispers in taverns and churchyards, now echoed in the halls of justice. They insisted that those who claimed authority over life and death should not be above the law. In doing so, they helped democratize medicine, ensuring that healing could no longer rest on secrecy and deception, but must submit to scrutiny and evidence. In the end, the trials were both a tragedy and a turning point. They ruined lives and destroyed communities, but they also cleared the ground for something new. Out of the humiliation of the courtroom emerged a profession that, though scarred, began to rebuild itself on firmer foundations. The apothecary's world of jars and powders, of whispered promises and hidden dangers, gave way to a new vision of pharmacy, one defined not by secrecy, but by regulation, not by tradition, but by science. The trials had been brutal, but they were also necessary. They forced a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. The image of the apothecary standing before the judge, trembling as his bottles were displayed like instruments of crime, remains one of the most powerful symbols of this era. It captures the collision of past and future, of deception and truth, of trust betrayed and trust reclaimed. The courtroom, in those moments, became more than a place of judgment. It became the crucible in which modern medicine was born. Not every apothecary vanished in disgrace, crushed beneath the weight of Mercury scandals, lead-laced potions, and the shrill accusations of fraud. Some adapted, and in their adaptation lies one of the most fascinating transformations in medical history. These survivors did not cling to the crumbling certainties of the past. They looked at the growing tide of scientific discovery, the rising voice of regulation, and the distrust simmering in the public, and instead of resisting, they reshaped themselves. They became chemists, pharmacists, dispensers of carefully measured powders and pills, and in time, the professional ancestors of the white-coated figures we know today. To trace their survival is to trace the survival of medicine itself as it evolved from superstition and commerce into something approaching modern science. The turning point came not from within the trade, but from without. Science, once a curiosity, had become a force. The apothecary who still believed that Mercury purged the body of sin, or that lead soothed the humors, found himself mocked by pamphleteers and distrusted by patients. Yet there were others who saw in chemistry not a threat but an opportunity. They began attending lectures, learning how to analyze compounds, how to distinguish a harmless tincture from a poisonous one, how to extract alkaloids and measure doses with scales instead of guesswork. These men, sometimes driven by desperation to salvage their reputations, slowly left behind the world of alchemy and deception. Their shops began to change. The dusty jars of powders were replaced by labeled bottles with Latin inscriptions, their contents documented, their effects tested, or at least claimed to be. It was not an easy transformation. Many customers still came seeking the old remedies, the miracle cures that promised swift relief without explanation. A mother with a sick child might demand laudanum, not caring that it contained opium. A syphilitic man might beg for mercury, believing it was his only hope. To deny them was to lose business. Yet the survivors learned a different trick: persuasion. They did not scorn the past remedies outright, but refrained them. Mercury became dangerous, yes, but perhaps a new powder distilled from quinine bark offered relief instead. Laudanum was too addictive, but morphine measured, refined, and administered carefully was a marvel of modern medicine. In this way, the apothecaries who endured managed to straddle two worlds, giving enough of the familiar to keep the desperate from leaving, while gradually introducing the safer, more scientific treatments that aligned them with the new medical order. The Apothecaries Act of 1815, while resented by many, proved a strange kind of salvation for those willing to adapt. For the first time, standards of education were required, and examinations demanded proof of competence. To some, this was ruin. To others, it was liberation. The exam became a way to draw a line between the reckless charlatan and the earnest practitioner. Surviving apothecaries studied, passed, and gained legitimacy. No longer were they merely shopkeepers with a flair for storytelling. They were now recognized professionals, their role codified in law. To the public, this mattered greatly. A sign above the door was no longer just a claim of expertise. It was evidence that the man within had been tested, trained, and sanctioned. The transformation from a shadowy seller of potions to a respected dispenser of drugs had begun. In towns across Britain, the survivor apothecaries remade themselves as community fixtures. They became the men people trusted for everyday ailments: the cough, the fever, the stomach upset. Their shops grew brighter, cleaner, and more orderly. Scales were polished, cabinets organized, prescriptions carefully recorded. Behind the counter, glass bottles gleamed in the light, each bearing neat labels: tincture of digitalis, quinine sulfate, powdered ipecacuanha. These were not the mysterious concoctions of old, but ingredients that could be named, measured, and increasingly explained through the language of science. The apothecary's authority no longer rested in secrecy, but in transparency. Customers were reassured by the sight of order and precision, by the sense that what they consumed was not a gamble, but a calculation. Of course, not all transformation was noble. Some apothecaries survived not by embracing science wholeheartedly, but by clever marketing. They capitalized on the public's hunger for safety, rebranding their shops as modern without changing much behind the counter. A new coat of paint, a Latin label, a nod to the latest discovery, and suddenly the same powders of questionable efficacy were sold as enlightened cures. Survival, after all, was not only for the honest, but also for the cunning. Yet, even these half measures shifted the trade, for they forced the idea of scientific legitimacy into the marketplace. The language of chemistry became part of the sales pitch, and in time, the demand for authenticity pushed even the pretenders to adapt more thoroughly. The survivor's greatest weapon, however, was time itself. As one generation of apothecaries died or faded into obscurity, the next came trained in laboratories and medical schools. The profession slowly sloughed off its past sins. The shopkeeper who once sold mercury-laden ointments gave way to his apprentice who had studied chemistry at university, who had dissected cadavers, who had sat in lectures beside physicians. The gap between apothecary and doctor began to narrow, and eventually the line blurred altogether. From their ranks emerged not only pharmacists, but also general practitioners, men who straddled the worlds of compounding and diagnosing, healing and dispensing. What is remarkable is how, despite scandal after scandal, the trade endured. Other professions might have crumbled under such a shadow accusations of poisoning, charges of fraud, public distrust, so fierce it was printed in newspapers. Yet the apothecaries, or at least some of them, found a way not only to survive, but to claim a future. They aligned themselves with progress at just the right moment. Where the quack clung to mystery and deception, the survivor leaned into the bright, hard light of science. The result was not merely personal redemption, but the birth of something new. From the ashes of lies and poisons rose the pharmacy as we know it today, regulated, trained, measured, and indispensable. But one cannot forget the cost of this survival. It was not merely the apothecaries who paid the price, but the countless patients who had trusted them in centuries past. Behind every modern pharmacy lies the ghost of a child, poisoned by lead-teething powders, the addict lost to laudanum, the syphilitic writhing from mercury salves. Survival was not clean. It was bought with suffering. And yet, history rarely grants second chances so generously. That a profession so tainted could emerge respected, essential, and scientific is both astonishing and troubling. The survivors were not saints, but they were adaptable, and adaptability, more than virtue, ensured their place in history. Even today, in the rows of modern pharmacies with their fluorescent lights and carefully packaged medicines, there is an echo of the old apothecary shop. The jars may be gone, the poisons replaced with regulated drugs, but the essence remains. A figure behind the counter, dispensing trust as much as tinctures. It is a legacy built not only on the sins of the past, but also on the determination of a few to evolve, to survive, and to transform. The story of the apothecary does not end with reform, nor with the triumph of science over superstition. It ends with something far more complicated. A poisoned legacy that still lingers in the shadow of modern medicine. For though the jars of mercury, the lead-based powders, and the bottles of opium tinctures have long been cleared from shop shelves, the echoes of their use remain imprinted on history. The legacy of the apothecary is not simply that they healed or harmed, but that they built a system of medicine on foundations both miraculous and monstrous, leaving us to grapple with the contradictions they passed down. To understand that legacy is to see both the progress and the peril embedded in the story of healing. The poisons themselves never truly disappeared. They seeped into the bones of those who trusted them, into the soil of old cities where discarded remedies spilled into the earth, into the bloodstream of generations marked by addiction. For some families, the damage was hereditary. Children were born to mothers who had consumed lead-laced tonics, carrying the silent burden of developmental delays that could never be undone. Addiction to opium, born in the days when laudanum was sold as casually as a loaf of bread, became a cycle that traveled down generations, reshaping not only personal lives, but entire communities. The poisoned legacy was not abstract. It was etched into the bodies of the innocent, carried like scars long after the apothecary's shop had closed its doors. There is a cruel irony in this, for many of these same substances, once vilified, became cornerstones of modern pharmacology. Morphine, extracted from opium, remains one of the most effective painkillers in existence. Digitalis, once sold without caution, is still prescribed for heart conditions. Mercury and arsenic, though deadly in crude form, led to the development of early chemotherapies. Even lead, stripped of its medicinal pretensions, found industrial uses that shaped the modern world. The legacy of poison, then, is not only in the harm it caused, but in the strange way it paved the road to progress. Without the apothecary's reckless experimentation, the boundaries of medical knowledge might not have expanded so quickly. Yet, this does not absolve them. It only complicates the ledger of history. The poisoned legacy also lives in the trust we place in medicine itself. For centuries, patients had no choice but to surrender themselves to the wisdom or folly of the man behind the counter. They swallowed what was given, believing that healing came in bottles and powders, that pain was a sign of purgation, that suffering was part of the cure. That blind faith, so easily exploited, created a pattern of deference that lingers even now. When we accept a prescription without question, when we assume that the pharmacist or doctor knows best, we are heirs to that tradition of uncritical trust. The apothecary's shadow reminds us that medicine has always walked the line between salvation and exploitation. There is also the question of memory, what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. Modern pharmacies rarely acknowledge their ancestry in the dimly lit apothecary shops, with their shelves of toxins masquerading as cures. To do so would be to admit that the noble science of medicine was born in a marketplace of deceit and desperation. Yet the poisoned legacy cannot be buried so easily. Museums preserve jars of mercury ointment, bottles of laudanum, and pamphlets advertising miracle cures not as curiosities, but as warnings. Each artifact is a silent accusation, a reminder that the profession once thrived, not on evidence but on audacity, not on knowledge but on the willingness of patients to gamble with their lives. And then there is the moral poison, the corruption of trust. For every apothecary who truly sought to heal, there were others who knowingly sold poisons, who preyed on fear, who turned illness into profit. Their legacy is not confined to history. Even today, industries rise and fall on the same principle, that desperation makes for easy customers. The supplement market, the unregulated promises of miracle diets, the whispers of cures too good to be true, they are modern reflections of the same poison trade. The apothecaries may be gone, but their methods, their manipulations, live on in every advertisement that promises health in exchange for faith and coin. The poisoned legacy extends beyond the marketplace to the very philosophy of medicine. In the age of apothecaries, disease was often seen as an enemy to be purged with violence. Patients were bled, purged, poisoned, and weakened in the hope that the illness would be driven out. This brutal philosophy, though largely abandoned, left traces that still haunt medicine today. The idea that treatment must be harsh to be effective, that suffering is proof of progress, persists in subtle ways. Patients endure grueling therapies, sometimes with more faith in the punishment than in the science. The shadow of the apothecary's lash still lingers over the bed of the ill. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this poisoned legacy is the silence of the patients who never survived to tell their stories. History records the names of great apothecaries, reformers, and physicians. but it rarely records the nameless child who died from a spoonful of syrup, the mother lost to postpartum addiction, the laborer crippled by mercury. Their lives were the true currency of the apothecaries' trade, their suffering the unacknowledged cost of progress. That silence is the heaviest part of the legacy, for it reminds us that medical history is not only a tale of discovery, but also of sacrifice, often unwilling and unseen. And yet, the poisoned legacy is not purely one of darkness. It is also a testament to resilience. Humanity endured the poisons, adapted to the addictions, learned from the deaths. Each failure became, in time, a lesson. The tragedy of mercury poisoning forced medicine to confront the dangers of toxic metals. The epidemic of laudanum addiction taught society to respect the power of opioids. The scandals of quackery spurred the demand for regulation and science. Out of poison came progress, bitter and costly though it was. The survivors of the poisoned legacy, both practitioners and patients, left behind knowledge that shaped the safer, more regulated systems we now depend upon. Still, the question lingers. How poisoned is the legacy we carry today? Modern medicine, for all its triumphs, is not immune to error, greed, or exploitation. The history of the apothecary warns us that every generation believes its medicine to be the pinnacle of knowledge, only to be humbled by discoveries yet to come. What we hail as miracle drugs today may one day be seen as crude, even dangerous. The poisoned legacy is, in this sense, a mirror held up to the present, reminding us that humility is as essential to healing as science itself. The apothecaries are long gone, their shops vanished into history, but their legacy lingers in every prescription bottle, every debate over regulation, every uneasy trust we place in those who claim to heal. It is a legacy of progress born from poison, of salvation built upon suffering. To confront it honestly is not to condemn medicine, but to understand it, to see that every cure has a cost, every breakthrough a shadow, every healer a trace of the apothecary who came before. And perhaps, in that understanding, we are better equipped to guard against repeating the same mistakes. The poisoned legacy, then, is not a relic of the past, but a living inheritance. It courses through our veins in the drugs we take, whispers in the advertisements that tempt us, and echoes in the silence of those who paid the price. It is both a warning and a foundation, a story of how healing and harm have always walked side by side. And as long as medicine exists, so too will the shadow of the apothecary. An enduring reminder that the line between cure and poison is perilously thin, and that trust, once tainted, is never easily restored.